You're holding up my line, ma'am. Either put the bag on the belt or step aside for someone who can follow simple instructions. The voice of TSA Agent Miller was a rasp of cheap authority, a sound scraped across the patience of 1,000 weary travelers before her. The crowd, a river of shuffling feet and rolling suitcases at Reagan National, offered a few nervous chuckles, the kind of laughter that sides with the bully out of a desperate need not to become the next target. She said nothing. Her gaze, calm and steady, remained on the worn canvas of her duffel bag, a simple, unadorned thing of faded olive drab that had seen more of the world than Miller ever would. She was a woman rendered deliberately invisible by her own design. Her hair was pulled back in a simple, severe bun, revealing a face with no makeup, a face that was neither young nor old, a map of quiet experiences that Miller, in his loud ignorance, mistook for weakness. Her clothes were functional, gray, and unremarkable, chosen not for style, but for their ability to blend into any crowd, anywhere. He saw a woman who was slow, confused, perhaps intimidated by the institutional bluster of his uniform. He saw a target. But the man who was now walking briskly through the terminal, a man with the weight of a nation on his shoulders, would have seen something else entirely. Had Director Evans of Homeland Security been there at that moment, he would have noticed not her slowness, but her economy of motion. He would have recognized the subtle, almost imperceptible shift in her weight, the way she stood perfectly balanced, a coiled spring of potential energy. He would have seen the constant, sweeping scan of her eyes, not looking at things, but through them, assessing angles, exits, and threats with a practiced, subconscious discipline that had been forged in crucibles Miller couldn't even imagine. He would have seen the hands that rested on her bag, not with hesitation, but with a serene, proprietary calm. Hands that were steady, scarred, and capable of a precision that was both terrifying and beautiful. Miller, however, saw none of this. He saw only an obstacle. His world was small, defined by the plastic bins and the droning hum of the X-ray machine, and his power was derived from the temporary inconvenience of others. He mistook her silence for fear, her calm for confusion. It was an assumption he would come to regret for the rest of his professional life, a mistake that would become a legend whispered in the break rooms and training academies of federal law enforcement for years to come. He was about to learn a lesson that the truly powerful have no need to announce their presence. If you believe that true strength is found not in the volume of the voice, but in the weight of one's actions, type competence below. The woman, whose name was Anna, finally lifted the bag. Its weight was familiar, a comfortable anchor in the transient chaos of the airport. She placed it gently onto the black conveyor belt, her movements fluid and deliberate. It was a simple action, performed thousands of times a day in this very spot, yet she did it with the focused precision of a surgeon laying out their instruments. Miller sighed, theatrically, a gust of performative frustration for the benefit of his audience. Finally, now shoes off, laptop out. Let's not make this an all-day affair. His words were laced with a condescending drawl, each syllable a small assertion of his dominance over this tiny, gray corner of the world. He puffed out his chest, the polyester of his uniform straining slightly. He was a man who had memorized the rule book, but had never once stopped to read the people it was meant to govern. Anna complied without a word. She slipped off her simple, practical boots and placed them in a gray bin. She moved with an unhurried grace that seemed to infuriate Miller even more. It was a calm he couldn't penetrate, a silence he couldn't fill with his own noise, and so he escalated. As she walked toward the full-body scanner, he stepped in front of her, blocking her path. Hold on. I think we need to do a random additional screening. It wasn't random. Everyone in the line knew it, and Miller made sure they did. His eyes scanned her up and down, a look of theatrical suspicion that was meant to humiliate. You just seem nervous. The irony was thick enough to taste. Of all the people in that terminal, the frantic businessmen checking their watches, the crying children, the families terrified of missing their flight, she was the single calmest person for 100 square miles. Her heart rate was as steady as a metronome. Her breathing was deep and even. She was an island of tranquility in a sea of manufactured stress. And this, more than anything, was what Miller's petty instincts registered as a threat. The line behind her ground to a halt. A collective sigh went through the crowd. They were now hostages to this little drama, this power play between a loud man in a uniform and a silent woman in gray. Anna simply stood there, her hands loosely at her sides, her gaze fixed on a point just over Miller's shoulder. She wasn't ignoring him. She was processing, analyzing. She was running threat assessments, calculating probabilities, and, most of all, actively suppressing years of training that screamed at her to neutralize the loud, unstable man in front of her as a potential security risk. Her inaction was not passivity. It was an act of profound, almost superhuman, discipline. She was a weapon that had chosen, for now, to remain unsafe. She had faced down men with far more power and far deadlier intent than this preening security agent, and she had done so with the same unnerving calm. The silence stretched, becoming a character in the scene. It was Anna's silence against Miller's noise, and the silence was winning. It was making him uncomfortable, forcing him to fill it. Got something to hide? He sneered, his voice rising. No problem. We've got all the time in the world. We'll just take a closer look at everything. Everything. He gestured vaguely at her simple bag, now moving slowly into the dark maw of the X-ray machine. He was making a promise, a threat of inconvenience and violation, the only weapon he had. And still, she said nothing. She just watched him, her expression unreadable, and waited for the world to catch up to the mistake he was making. He was poking a sleeping bear, unaware that it wasn't a bear at all, but something far more dangerous, something the world had spent millions of dollars training to be the apex predator in the global wilderness. He was about to discover that some people don't need to raise their voice because their very existence is a statement of fact, a truth as hard and undeniable as gravity. Miller's patience, a thin and brittle thing, finally snapped. Her silence was a mirror, and he did not like the reflection of the flustered, petty tyrant he saw staring back. He interpreted her professional stillness as personal defiance, a quiet mockery of his authority. That's it, he barked, his voice cracking with a frustration that was rapidly curdling into rage. You want to be difficult? Fine. We're doing this my way. He reached out and grabbed her arm. It was a clumsy, telegraphed move, the action of a man used to compliance, not resistance. The moment his fingers closed around her bicep, he must have felt it. The arm was not soft or yielding, but a corded bundle of steel forged by a decade of discipline he could not comprehend. It was like grabbing a piece of machinery. The surprise flickered in his eyes, but he was too committed to his performance to back down. He tightened his grip, pulling her out of the line. Step over here. Now. He gestured toward a sterile, walled-off area reserved for secondary screenings. The move was unnecessarily aggressive, a piece of security theater designed to intimidate and assert control. But Anna did not resist. She did not pull away. She moved with his pull, absorbing the momentum with a subtle shift of her hips, a technique taught in the windowless training rooms of places that don't appear on any public map. To the onlookers, it appeared she stumbled. To a trained eye, she had just flawlessly redirected his force, maintaining her own center of gravity while making his aggression look even more oafish and uncontrolled. He shoved her, not violently, but with a firm, demeaning pressure against the wall of the screening area. Stay there, he commanded, his face inches from hers, his voice a low growl. Don't move. Her back made contact with the cool, painted cinder block. Her right hand, splayed for balance, pressed flat against the wall beside a small, metallic panel. The panel was unremarkable, a standard biometric access point for federal-level overrides, installed in all major airports after September 11th. It was meant for high-ranking officials from the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, or certain Pentagon task forces to use in the event of a national emergency, a way to bypass local systems and assume direct control. It required a palm print and a pressure-activated 5-finger sequence. To Miller, it was just part of the wall. To the airport's integrated security system, the specific, firm pressure of Anna's hand was the beginning of a query, a digital question asked in a language of absolute authority. The system registered the unique whirls of her fingerprints, the exact pressure of her palm, and the almost imperceptible sequence of contact her fingers made against the surface. It was not a code she had consciously entered. It was a reflexive posture, a muscle memory from 1,000 crisis simulations, a way of bracing for impact that was also a key turning in a lock of immense power. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Miller, feeling he had finally won, finally broken her composure, smirked. He turned to signal another agent to bring him her bag for a full, invasive, and deliberately slow manual search. He was savoring his victory. That was his second mistake. The first was touching her. The second was turning his back. Because in that instant, the airport's digital nervous system found a match. It found a name, a file so deeply encrypted that the system itself didn't have the clearance to open it. It only had one instruction, a single, terrifyingly simple command protocol associated with that biometric signature. Protocol 0. And then it began. It wasn't loud. It was the opposite of loud. It was a sudden, cascading absence of sound. The first thing to go was the incessant, cheerful boarding announcement from the overhead speakers, which cut off mid-sentence. Then the rhythmic beeping of the baggage scanners ceased, replaced by a profound, echoing silence. The low, constant hum of the massive digital display boards showing arrivals and departures vanished as every single one of them flickered and went black. It was a wave of digital silence that rolled through the terminal, wiping the slate clean. The screens at the check-in counters for American, Delta, and United all went dark. The screens at the customer service desks went dark. The screens in the air traffic control tower, showing the radar signatures of dozens of planes in the sky, went dark, replaced by a single, pulsing red icon. A stylized eagle with a key in its talons, the sigil of a security clearance, so high it was practically mythological. The automated doors hissed shut and locked. The electronic payment systems at every Starbucks and Hudson News froze mid-transaction. The entire digital infrastructure of one of the world's busiest airports had been brought to its knees in less than a second. In the security area, the X-ray machine monitor, which had just begun to display the contents of Anna's simple duffel bag, flashed a blinding white before displaying a new message in stark, block letters. System lockdown. Agent action required. Do not engage. Await validator. Stand down. The words pulsed with an authority that made Miller's petty commands seem like a child's tantrum. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, filled with the sudden, dawning horror of thousands of people realizing that something was profoundly wrong. The nervous chatter of the line died. Every head turned, trying to find the source of the shutdown. But there was no source. There was only a quiet woman in gray, standing perfectly still, her hand resting calmly against a wall, and a terrified TSA agent whose face had gone from flushed red to a pasty, sickly white. His swagger evaporated, replaced by a primal fear. He stared at the frozen screens, then at the woman, then back at the screens. The equation was simple, impossible, and undeniable. He had pushed her against the wall, and she had turned off the sky. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The word he was looking for was impossible, but the evidence was all around him, a silent, blinking testament to a power he had not known existed in the world. He had tried to make her small, and in response, a system designed to protect the nation had made him infinitesimal. He was no longer a gatekeeper. He was a witness to an event far outside his comprehension, a man who had stumbled out of his jurisdiction and into the domain of ghosts and legends. A low, insistent alarm began to sound. Not a fire alarm, but something deeper, more resonant. It was a sound few had ever heard outside of drills, the summons for the airport's highest-level emergency response team. Heavy, magnetically locked doors, unseen by the public, began to slide open at the far end of the terminal, and from them emerged men in black tactical gear, their movements calm, practiced, and radiating a level of professionalism that made Miller's uniform look like a costume. They didn't run. They flowed, establishing a perimeter with an efficiency that was terrifying to behold. They ignored the gawking passengers. They ignored the panicked airport staff. They moved with a singular purpose, their eyes all focused on the epicenter of the shutdown, the secondary screening area where a single woman stood with her hand against the wall. The lead agent, a man with the cold, clear eyes of a seasoned operator, held up a hand, halting his team a respectful 20 yards away. He didn't raise his weapon. He didn't shout commands. He simply stood, waiting. He recognized the pulsing red sigil on the screens. He knew what Protocol Zero meant. It meant that a designated asset of critical national importance was on site and had, for reasons unknown, activated their emergency authentication. His job now was not to contain a threat, but to secure the area for the arrival of the only person authorized to resolve this situation, a validator. Miller, who was still standing frozen between the tactical team and Anna, was now the very picture of irrelevance. The situation had escalated so far beyond his pay grade that he had ceased to be a participant. He was merely part of the scenery. His authority, which 30 seconds ago had felt absolute to him, had been revealed as a complete fiction. He was a child who had been playing with a toy badge in the presence of a true sovereign. He finally found his voice, a pathetic, squeaking whisper. "What? What did you do?" he stammered, looking at Anna. She finally turned her head, her gaze meeting his for the first time. There was no anger in her eyes. There was no triumph. There was only a profound, weary calm, the look of someone who had hoped to have a quiet day and had been denied it by the foolish pride of a lesser man. She said nothing. Her silence was his answer. It told him that she hadn't done anything. She simply was something that he, in his arrogance, had failed to recognize. The universe had not been altered by an action she had taken. It had simply bent to the reality of who she was. The air crackled with a new tension as a side door near the TSA checkpoint opened and a man strode through. He was in his late 60s, dressed in a simple but impeccably tailored suit. He moved with a quiet authority that made the tactical team look like raw recruits. This was Director Evans. He didn't look at the tactical team, he didn't look at the frozen screens, and he certainly didn't look at the gawking crowd. His eyes found Anna immediately, and a flicker of recognition, of profound respect, passed across his face. He knew the stance. He knew the stillness. He had seen it before in briefing rooms in windowless basements and on grainy satellite feeds from the dark corners of the world. "Stand down, everyone." Evans's voice was calm, but it cut through the tension like a razor, an immediate and absolute command. The tactical team leader nodded once, and his men relaxed, lowering their weapons but maintaining their perimeter. Evans walked directly to the TSA command podium, his shoes making no sound on the tiled floor. He ignored Miller completely, as if the man were a piece of furniture. He keyed in a code on a secure terminal, then placed his own palm on a scanner. A single screen flickered to life in front of him, displaying a secure portal. He typed for a moment, his fingers moving with practiced certainty. He was looking for the trigger, the identity of the asset who had initiated Protocol Zero. The system presented him with a file designation, Operator Nightingale. There was no photo. There was no date of birth. There was only a string of clearances and commendations that made Evans, a man who had served 3 presidents, feel a deep censoring of awe. Unit, 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, assigned to a joint task force, so classified it was referred to only by a symbol. Combat hours, classified. Mission history, classified. Medals, Distinguished Service Cross, 3 silver stars for bronze stars with valor, a Purple Heart so secret it was awarded in a sealed room with only a single general present. Status, active, deep cover, non-official legend. The designation Nightingale was a legend even among the intelligence community's elite, a ghost who moved through the world's most dangerous places, a specialist in de-escalation and high-value extraction who had, on more than one occasion, single-handedly prevented wars. She was supposed to be a myth, a story told to frighten new recruits. And Agent Miller had just slammed her against a wall. Evans took a deep, steadying breath. He looked over the terminal at Anna, who had not moved. She was still standing there, a portrait of patience, waiting for the system to be put right. Then he looked at Miller, truly looked at him for the first time, and his expression was one of cold, surgical fury. He had seen this kind of casual arrogance before, the petty abuse of power that so often led to disaster. He had spent his life trying to stamp it out, to teach his people that respect was not a gift to be given, but a debt to be paid to every single citizen, because you never, ever knew who you were talking to. He raised his voice, not shouting, but projecting it so that every agent within earshot could hear him clearly. Agent Miller, he said, the name dropping into the silent room like a stone. Miller flinched as if struck. "Sir," he mumbled, his eyes wide with fear. Evans walked toward him, his gaze unwavering. "Agent Miller, you are to hand over your badge and your credentials. You are suspended, pending a full investigation. You will be escorted from this terminal and will await further instructions." The words were delivered without emotion, a simple statement of fact. The professional verdict had been rendered. Then, Evans did something that sent a shockwave through every law enforcement officer present. He walked past Miller, stopping directly in front of Anna. He squared his shoulders, stood at perfect attention, and rendered a slow, formal, and deeply respectful salute. It was the salute of a senior director to a soldier who had earned more respect on any given Tuesday than Miller had in his entire life. "Ma'am," Evans said, his voice now filled with a quiet reverence that stood in stark contrast to his tone with Miller. "I am Director Evans. My apologies for the delay. The system is resetting now. Please, allow me to escort you to your flight." Anna finally lowered her hand from the wall. She looked at the director, a man of immense power saluting her in the middle of a paralyzed airport, and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Thank you, Director," she said. It was the first time she had spoken in 10 minutes. Her voice was low, calm, and utterly devoid of triumph. The legend of the Checkpoint Zero incident spread not like wildfire, but like the slow, inexorable rising of a tide. It wasn't shouted from the rooftops. It was whispered in hushed tones in secure briefing rooms, passed between pilots over encrypted channels, and typed into the classified forums used by intelligence officers to share cautionary tales. The story became a modern fable within the vast ecosystem of national security. New TSA recruits at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Georgia were no longer just shown videos on how to spot suspicious items. They were now sat down for a mandatory session on professional humility, where an instructor would tell them the sanitized, anonymous story of a mid-level agent who mistook a national hero for a non-compliant passenger and, in doing so, single-handedly shut down one of the nation's most critical infrastructure hubs. They were taught to look not for signs of aggression, but for signs of unusual calm. They were instructed that a lack of reaction is not a vacuum, but often a container for discipline and experience beyond their comprehension. The phrase, "don't cause a nightingale event," became institutional shorthand for de-escalation, a reminder that the person in front of you might be infinitely more important and infinitely more dangerous than you could ever know. The name Anna was never used. The location was often changed, but the core of the story remained. Assumptions are a liability that a true professional can never afford. For Agent Miller, the consequences were not merely professional, they were existential. He wasn't fired. That would have been too easy, too clean. Instead, he was reassigned. He was sent to a remote archival facility in a forgotten corner of Kansas, where his new job was to digitally scan and catalog the service records of decorated veterans from forgotten wars. For 10 hours a day, 5 days a week, he sat in a silent, climate-controlled room, his only company the ghosts of heroes. He was forced to read, page by page, the quiet, documented evidence of profound competence and sacrifice. He read citations for valor that made the hair on his arms stand up. He saw the names of young men who had held the line against impossible odds, of women who had flown transport planes through enemy fire, of spies who had lived for years behind enemy lines. He was immersed in a world of quiet professionals, a world he had never known existed, and the sheer weight of their collective dignity slowly, painfully, began to crush the brittle arrogance he had mistaken for strength. One day, months into his new assignment, he came across a heavily redacted file. Most of it was blacked out, but a single, unredacted line in the commendations section caught his eye. It described an operator who, while wounded and under heavy fire, successfully negotiated the release of 3 captured journalists. Her calm and steady voice over the radio de-escalating a situation that was minutes away from becoming an international tragedy. The code name at the top of the page was Nightingale. Miller stopped typing. He stared at the word for a long time. The hum of the servers the only sound in the room. In that moment, he finally understood. His punishment was not the demotion, not the isolation. His punishment was enlightenment. He was being forced to see the world as it truly was, a world full of quiet, unassuming people who carried the weight of civilization on their shoulders without complaint or need for recognition. The memory of his actions at the airport no longer filled him with fear of reprisal, but with a deep and profound sense of shame. He had not just failed as an agent. He had failed as a man, unable to recognize the quiet greatness standing right in front of him. The ripple effects of that day continued to spread. The Department of Homeland Security, under Evans's direction, fast-tracked the development of a new, discrete identification system for assets like Anna. It was a simple pin, no larger than a dime, that could be worn on a lapel or a collar. It emitted a low-frequency signal that would alert security systems to the presence of a high-clearance individual, flagging them not for more scrutiny, but for less. It became known colloquially as the Nightingale pin, a small, silent symbol of earned respect. The protocol was simple. If the system flagged an individual, agents were to be courteous, efficient, and unobtrusive. They were to expedite the screening with minimal interaction. The goal, as Evans stated in a department-wide memo, was to ensure that our guardians can move among us unimpeded, for their silent work keeps us all safe. The culture of the TSA, slowly and incrementally, began to shift. The emphasis moved away from confrontational security theater and toward a more intelligent, observation-based model. The story of what happened at Reagan National became the foundation of this new philosophy. It served as a permanent, institutional reminder that the most formidable people are often the ones you notice least. And Anna? She caught her flight. Director Evans had personally walked her to the gate, clearing a path through the now rebooting and chaotic terminal. He had offered a government jet, a private security detail, anything she needed. She had politely refused. "I have a window seat," she'd said with the faintest hint of smile. "I'm fine." He watched as she boarded the commercial flight to Omaha, taking her place between a college student listening to music and a grandmother knitting a scarf. She pulled a worn paperback from her duffel bag, and as the plane taxied to the runway, she began to read, disappearing once more into the quiet, unassuming anonymity that was both her camouflage and her greatest weapon. She was a ghost, a protector who wanted no thanks, no recognition, only the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. The incident at the airport was, to her, just another unforeseen complication in a life full of them, a problem to be managed with minimal fuss before returning to the mission. Her legacy was not in the screen she froze or the agent she humbled. It was in the silent, invisible shield she and others like her provided for the very people who might otherwise have told them to hurry up and get out of the way. A few weeks after the incident, a framed photograph appeared on the wall of the TSA break room at Reagan National. It wasn't a picture of Anna or Director Evans. It was a stock photo of a simple, unmarked, olive-drab duffel bag, the kind used by soldiers the world over. Underneath, it was a small brass plaque. It didn't mention Protocol Zero or Operator Nightingale. It contained only 4 words, a new mantra for a new era of security professionals. Respect the bag. Respect everyone. The lesson had been learned. It had been seared into the agency's memory by the deafening silence that had fallen over the terminal that day. It was a silence that spoke volumes, a quiet testament to the fact that competence doesn't need to boast, professionalism doesn't need to posture, and true authority is something you carry inside you, not something pinned to your chest. The story became a teaching tool, a piece of institutional folklore passed down from senior agents to rookies. The details would shift with each telling, the legend growing over time. In some versions, she disabled the tactical team with a single look. In others, she spoke a single word that caused the system to crash. But the core truth always remained the same. A loud, arrogant man made an assumption based on what he saw, and a quiet, professional woman reminded an entire government agency that true strength is invisible. A year later, Director Evans was giving the commencement address at the FBI National Academy at Quantico. He spoke of courage, integrity, and the challenges of modern law enforcement. Toward the end of his speech, he paused and looked out at the sea of eager, newly minted agents. "You will be given a badge and a gun," he said, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone. "You will be given authority, but you will not be given respect. That you must earn. You will earn it not by the arrests you make or the doors you kick in, but by how you treat the people you are sworn to protect, especially the ones who seem the most ordinary." He paused again, letting the words sink in. "There are guardians who walk among us. They don't wear uniforms. They don't seek recognition. They are the quiet professionals who hold the line between chaos and order. They are the woman in the grocery store, the man reading a book on the subway. Your greatest challenge and your most profound duty will be to recognize the strength in their silence, to see the dignity they carry without announcement. Never mistake stillness for weakness. Never mistake silence for fear. In our line of work, the loudest person in the room is often the most insecure. The calmest is the one you should listen to. The story of that day had completed its journey from a chaotic event to a guiding principle. It was no longer about a single agent's failure, but about a collective institutional success, the ability to learn, to adapt, and to embed a lesson into the very DNA of the organization. The legacy of Anna's silent stand was not one of humiliation, but one of education. It was a permanent reminder that the fabric of national security is woven not just with technology and weaponry, but with wisdom, humility, and the simple, profound act of treating every individual with the respect they are due, for you never know when you are standing in the presence of greatness. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance, and where silent discipline defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.